I'm Sid Mead, and this is the first disc of 4 in a series of DVDs, which are the process of making a picture. Picture making is storytelling in its own way, and when I do illustrations, or renderings, we'll call them later, I always start with very small little drawings called thumbnails. I have no idea why, but they're very small, and what you are doing is planning the picture in just 2 values, black and white, at a very small scale. And that's the secret, I think, of successful picture making, is to decide very early on what your trial and error process is going to produce. At this very small scale, you immediately see the black and white composition sense of what eventually will be a finished rendering, and in this series, 20 by 30 inches. So go ahead, watch the DVD, and we're off and running in the picture-making process.
Illustration is the visualizing of scenario of a place to be that exists in a picture. And for me, the way to start out is to do what I call thumbnails, and they literally are very, very tiny little drawings. And the technique is to only work in black and white. That represents essentially shadow and sunlight. And if you're familiar with scanning techniques and so forth, it's like doing a hand-done threshold version of what you're eventually going to end up with as a illustration. So this process forces you to think in terms of black and white, sunlight and shadow, and the trick is to design the shadows so that they occur behind or in front of or framing the subject matter of the illustration. And I'm starting to draw the central feature of this illustration, which is called a hypervan, just a privately invented theoretical high-speed luxury vehicle. And the composition is all being done in a 2 by 3 proportion rectangle, because I'm going to eventually paint the rendering on a 20 by 30 illustration board. So now you see the shape is starting to come into the white of the paper. I'm filling in the black spots or shadows. And as this progresses, we'll do several variations on this, because you're obviously not going to hit perfection on the first try. We're putting in foliage on the right side of the illustration. And when this first small little thumbnail is finished, you'll have an immediate idea of the organization of the finished illustration. There'll be variations as we go along, of course, but we now have a start. Starting the second one essentially is looking at the first one and replanning the layout, little minor details and so forth, that eventually make the illustration a very interesting and believable illustration of a car or vehicle sitting in a courtyard. I centered the illustration in proportion. You want your horizon line, which is the eye level of the observer. This is very important. If you forget where your horizon is, you're going to make mistakes in positioning people, in positioning objects that are behind or in front of the primary illustration object. So it's very important to establish the horizon line, which is a horizontal line that always is level with the eye of the observer. When you're doing illustration, what you're trying to do is to convince the person looking at the illustration that it's a believable scene. Even fantasy has some level of believability to it, otherwise you simply don't know what you're looking at. So I'm preparing some of these black spots, which essentially are shadow areas. Maybe they're architectural, they could be foliage, they could be simply just shadow lines on a masonry wall. But what I'm doing is experimenting with different spacings and different proportions of the shadow versus white areas of the illustration. And these variations don't have to be that great. They can be refinements at this stage, because if you work your mechanical layout, proportions, and so forth of the illustration at this scale in only 2 values, black and white, it'll look better when it gets bigger and you add color and shaded values. So this is the start of a successful illustration that only is limited to black and white. Having done this kind of illustration, elaborate color illustration, for about, well, let's say over 40 years, if it looks good at this scale, it's going to look terrific at the full size. This is a very critical stage in the invention of a illustration layout. And at this stage, you don't have to be that careful about the exact design. That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is literally planning the major value areas of a finished picture, of the finished picture. The variations don't have to be that great, but it's necessary to decide before you go to the next stage how your picture is going to be organized. Because what you're essentially doing in illustration is to produce the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. And then you paint this. Regardless of the technique, whether it's digital or hand-done, the picture theory remains the same. You have to have a primary object. You have to have careful arrangement of black and white or value shifts. And once you have that locked down, then you can start to make the picture more elaborate in terms of value of steps and color, which in my mind is the last thing you think about. Black and white represents the total spread of what you have available to you when you make an illustration. Obviously, this is not light emittive, although it's being viewed most likely on an electronic device. But your piece of art is essentially an illusion on a reflective surface, and you have only 9 steps to work with, from black to white. That's your limitation. It's also good, once you've got your, let's say, your horizontal view, your primary view arranged, to experiment with maybe other views of the object in the frame proportion of 2 by 3 in this case. So what we're doing now is drawing a down view of this vehicle to see if the value separations, the black to white areas, make a nice, convincing picture. It's the same vehicle, same situation, only what we're doing is doing a 3-dimensional revolve as if you raised the camera, the theoretical camera, above the object that is being shown in the illustration. This is a critical skill, actually, to be able to rotate your theoretical view in many different angles to get the optimum view, because with an illustration you have one choice. You are essentially making a one-choice best view of a 3-dimensional situation on a 2-dimensional surface. It's a challenge, and if you master the picture-making art of doing this, then you can transfer that feeling, that skill, that visualization technique into many, many other mediums. Another advantage of taking these tiny, tiny little drawings is that they're very quick, and using your drawing skills already developed, you can rapidly make several choices as to the best picture opportunity. So now we've rotated the view. We're looking down. We have the suggestion of perhaps a doorway. We have suggestion of foliage. And the next thumbnail starts off with variations essentially on the first 2 approaches. Horizon line. And we've decided to stick with the profile view of this vehicle to show how it What we're doing now is to look at the rear of the vehicle to see if the scene can rotate and look just as attractive, to feature the vehicle in a different view, and all still within the 2 by 3 proportion of the frame, which is the limits of the illustration. And again, we're backing up white areas, which is the vehicle essentially. with shadow, with foliage, with all the picture-making devices that are available to you. And the situation can be in a courtyard, it can be on a lawn. In this case, we're illustrating a vehicle in a courtyard, and as we progress into the process, we'll see that it's a kind of futuristic version of a classic, let's say, European Gothic courtyard. The contrast between the futuristic, the new, the vehicle, and more classic architectural scenario, I think will make a very interesting finished illustration. So we've rotated the vehicle. Now we're looking at it from the rear. We get the shape of the cross section. We see the rear plate with, let's say, rear lights. We have a foliage bank in front, silhouetting the vehicle, black against white, so we can see the shape. The horizon line essentially remains the same as in the profile, because what we want to do is to accentuate the horizontal design of the vehicle. So we have our frame another time around, sort of a horizontal alignment, and now we're doing a little bit more into styling or designing what's going to be behind this vehicle. The vehicle is long and low and very organic in configuration, and what we want is to reflect part of that in the background, but more in a more geometric alignment, geometric idea than the vehicle itself. So what we've done is draw a round doorway. We'll shade that in a moment. This is a kind of a chinoise or Chinese architectural feature from that culture base. But it also has a Romanesque look to it, the round arch as opposed to the Gothic pointed arch. Horizon line is established exactly even with the horizontal cut line from body to wheel sets of the Hypervan vehicle. This is going to be a very formal side view of this vehicle, to present it as if we're doing perhaps a series of illustrations for a formal brochure. It harks back to the early days of the automobile, when cars were in fact designed in profile. So even though this is a futuristic vehicle, we are adhering to the classic history of private transportation in terms of advertising or visualization format. We've now established for sure where the vanishing point is in the illustration. We're experimenting with perhaps another architectural background to this vehicle illustration. The vanishing point is on the horizon line, and the horizon line, as we said before, is even with the observer's eye. Now, the selection of the vanishing point is very important in an illustration because you don't want to put it exactly in the middle. You don't want it too high or too low if you're doing this kind of a view of the theoretical vehicle. So we've put it just behind the front wheel enclosure. That means that the rear wheel extensions will be shown on the other side in sort of shadow, so it gives dimension. But the ground plane, the detail, everything that has to do with things coming forward or into the picture from the foreground, all disappear to the vanishing point on the horizon line. This was a composition experiment to throw a shadow over the vehicle, and that's the shading, an overhead fixture of some sort. We'll solve that later. We're still isolating the whites and the darks by backing them up, backing the white areas up with dark, black. So sticking with the 2:3 proportion, We're going to do one more view, a trial, looking down on the vehicle, perhaps to just see if our original decision was correct in looking at it in profile. We're casting light from the upper left side of the illustration as an experiment, because you have to remember that an illustration is in essence a graphical image on a flat surface, the picture plane. So if you're arranging the illustration in black and white at this stage, what you really are doing is organizing a very precise graphical positioning map, which you will use as you go on and produce the finished piece of art. We're using the round gate, sort of the chinoise gate. We're looking down on the vehicle, once again, to see if this view might be as interesting as the profile view. We've decided that the profile view is best as a formal look at the vehicle from the side, and we're assuming that there are other views that will satisfy the sort of three-dimensional design display of this particular vehicle. So what we're doing now is setting up the illustration at a slightly larger scale. We're aligning things that are three-dimensional that go back into the picture, like the gate, the round gate. It has depth to it. Perhaps it's part of an actual building. It's going through a very thick wall. But what we're doing essentially is designing the graphical arrangement of the finished illustration. This is a larger scale now than the thumbnails. You'll notice that we haven't put the vehicle in yet because we're thinking three-dimensionally. The vehicle is in front, but we have to design what's behind it first. Otherwise, we're going to have leftover edges, leftover detail that we didn't think about, and that's not a nice thing to have happen. So we're creating the stage set at this point. We're putting in almost a medieval kind of a motif, but we're ramping it up to a more, let's say, retro-future treatment of classic architectural ornamentation. We have the round gate. We have possibly steps going up into it. We have two features coming in to interrupt the circle outline of the gate, steps coming down to plaza level. We have an indication of foliage to the right. We have a kind of coat of arms, family crest on top of the round gate circle. And now we're starting to scale to the human figure, 6 foot standard height. Working with figures in an illustration is critical to understand the horizon line, how things grow or shrink as they come toward the observer or disappear towards the horizon line and the vanishing point. Once you lose that scale and you lose the match-up to the surface they're standing on, you've lost the whole three-dimensional illusion of the illustration. Over on the far right, we're adding a little bit more scenario. We have two creatures. They're sort of mutated horse creatures with riders. And this inspiration came from looking at the costumes and the regalia and the animals, of course, for a formal hunt. So the scenario has developed into a futuristic vehicle sitting in a pseudo-retro futuristic medieval courtyard with people ready to go on a formal hunt. Now we can put the vehicle in. We've got it scaled, we've got people standing around, and now we can put the featured vehicle into the composition. We can position it now against the background that we've created already. The vanishing point, as we did in the thumbnail, is behind the front wheel extension. So we're on our way to creating a formal, final line drawing for a very detailed, eventually, illustration. We have scale, we have people, and we have scenario. I think that successful fantasy, techno-fantasy illustration has all of these elements. It has scenario, it has people taking part in the scenario. That makes the observer feel a little bit more comfortable. If you have people doing something that you don't even have to define necessarily what they're doing, but the fact that they're there makes the observer feel a little bit more comfortable with the subject, and then you can add weird stuff because you've established that there are people just like you enjoying the same scene. We've redrawn the composition again. You go through these phases and you think of things as you're drawing, and you think, well, let's make that a little bit higher, make that a little bit lower, let's put a slant line in here, let's stretch this. So you do this several times, and at this scale, using just pen and paper, you can arrive at optimum composition solutions very, very rapidly. And believe me, once you start your final illustration, you'll be very, very glad that you were this careful and this concentrated at the front end of the visualization process. You'll notice that the two oblongs coming in to interrupt the round gate shape have now been made round themselves as a kind of parallel repeat with a descending slant, which would be rendered eventually in stonework in detail. So we're making much more of these two features than we did in the original line drawing sketch. This kind of arrangement, it's facade, it's formal facade to go along with the formal idea, the formal notion of this very, very formal side view, profile view of the featured vehicle. We've once again put people in the archway for scale. We're doing a little bit of shading to sort of strengthen some of these geometric lines that we've created to really convince ourselves that this is the way to go. Even though the vehicle is going to go over this part of the illustration, nevertheless, it still is a good idea to, in your mind, recreate the three-dimensional stage set so that when you do put the vehicle into place, everything behind it actually still exists. You're just occluding it with the vehicle. In that way, you're completing your three-dimensional understanding of what you're doing. And if you decided to change the view even later on, decided to, well, maybe another view is the best, you'd have designed all this and you could rotate the view and without too much more trouble, go right into another version of your finished line drawing. We're just adding details. It could be masonry, it could be texturing on the masonry casting or the stone, whatever material we decide to illustrate as the facade base. And eventually we'll add foliage and so forth to soften this. But the idea is to create it's called rustication, a rusticated treatment of this facade so that it looks like cast or hand-hewn stone, to give it that ancient look, even though it's, let's say, retro future. It's all about alignment, it's about proportion, it's about creating an interesting view of a non-existent scenario, because obviously if something already exists, you can take a photograph. What we're doing is creating, in essence, a fake, faux photograph of a theoretical scene which may never occur, but has to look absolutely convincing and absolutely real. We're indicating sort of highly stylized foliage. It could be actually carved masonry to look like foliage. That's been done before, of course. Classic ornamentation uses that inspiration all the time to augment real foliage. So we now have a completely different feeling to the facade that's behind the featured vehicle. We have rustication, we have little details, we have suggested to ourselves possible detail shifts which are different from the previous sketch drawing. If you're successful in doing a series of these, it should be difficult for you to decide which one you like the best. I was always taught that the final solution should be just as much a surprise to you as it is to somebody seeing the illustration for the first time. I think that's a fairly good rule. You should let yourself go. You can feel the flow of creativity and experiment. And at this stage with a sketch, you can do that very rapidly instead of locking yourself into something which eventually you're going to spend a lot of time on and may not even like. And the client might not like it either. If clients are visually sophisticated, you can actually show them drawings at this stage. If they're not, personally, I wouldn't advise it, having had client relations for almost half a century. If they're not visually sophisticated, they'll look at this and think you've been, taking time off. It doesn't look finished enough, and they can't visualize, they can't fill in the scenario in their minds to look at a drawing like this and think what it could be when it's all done. They just simply don't have the visual mentality or the vocabulary in their heads to look at what you're doing and appreciating what it's going to look like once they get it and pay for it. We're fussing a little bit over a theoretical coat of arms or a family, maybe a historical standard, all in the effort to make this look authentically real, even though it's a complete invention, stylized after a pseudo, let's say, retro-future medieval monumental look for a facade. Those areas up there could be cast in stone or carved to resemble foliage on the walls above and each side of the gate. Let's refine the outline of the gate a little bit more. And we'll darken the inside now to show depth. And actually to reinforce the roundness of the gate itself. At this stage, don't worry about compasses or mechanical means of drawing, making the sketch. Just concentrate on composition, on design interest, relative scale, where your horizon line is, and because all you're doing now is to set the front end of your illustration so that you like it, it looks good, and then when you refine to the eventual line drawing, which will be in another session, then you can refine circles, realign people, redraw the characters, and have a finished illustration ready to go. We're adding a little bit of rustication, foliage, over the stonework. This softens it. And if you've ever toured classic campuses, particularly older universities that have this elaborate stone architecture, and always there's foliage to soften the harsh lines of the stone buildings. Foliage indication is fascinating because you go either on sort of stylized lines, or you can actually use photographic reference, which I do all the time, to duplicate the pattern of leaves and branches and so forth. And then as you get more familiar with foliage, you can stylize and do falls and more pointed, larger scale drawings. We did this before, but what we're going to do now is to test how three-dimensional our scenario could be. We're going to do a little bit more detailed sketch, looking down on the featured vehicle in the courtyard, which we've now designed, pretty much, to just test one more time whether our choice of this profile view is actually the best one. So we're modeling the vehicle. Once we get the three-dimensional shape drawn from essentially the horizon line and the profile view up to the body of the vehicle, now we can draw the vehicle in 3 dimensions. and the shadow. We have light coming, if you recall, in the profile. The light is coming from above and behind us, but at a very, very shallow angle. It's what they call straking across the facade, so that we get shadow lines, but we don't put a shadow on the vehicle itself. We're drawing maybe a platform, something to indicate surface, because in any view that you do in this kind of artwork, the surface that the vehicle is sitting on is very important. It could be stone, it could be brick, it could be asphalt, concrete, and if you sort of articulate the surface, it makes the illustration much more interesting. That base circle I just drew is the base of a foliage clump, which in the profile view is off to the far right of the illustration. Now we're doing perspective lines. We're still not using a ruler or any formal mechanical devices because they take too much time, and we're going to do that later anyway. What we're doing is further three-dimensionalizing our stage set, if you will, to satisfy ourselves that when we finally go to the line drawing, down line a little bit, we'll have in our minds the complete three-dimensional reality of the stage set, so we can treat it as one view of a three-dimensional scenario. This is a slight variation on the gate shape. We now have a soft S-curve or OG curve arch over the two rectangular projections which go up into the gate. Just one more chance to say, do we really want to do the round gate, or do we want it more rectilinear, more formal, more geometric, severely geometric? We'll probably retain the two oblong shapes, the rectangle shapes, interrupting the round circle. We'll still keep those, as you will see as we go on into the process. The foliage at the far right and now at the upper right of the illustration. Once you get into the technique of depicting foliage, it's great fun to do because it's randomized. It's not as mechanically perfect. It gives you a chance to offset your careful illustration of a mechanical object with the softness of natural, random contours. Being able to three-dimensionalize a picture, a scenario, is a very, very valuable skill. It frees you from not being able to change the drawing. It allows you to literally change your mind, change the view, and turns you into a sort of director of your illustration in terms of making choices that could enhance or completely change your point of view of what you're in the process of doing, of illustrating. We're going to very roughly indicate one of the genetically altered horse creatures up at the upper left next to the foliage. This is not a terribly precise drawing of a horse-like vehicle, but what it is to complete the scenario in this down view to see if we still like it, now that it's been rotated and the camera has lifted up and it's shooting down. Reinforcing the whole idea of horizon line, very important. Our picture limits. And what we're going to do is to now sort of start to formalize our real final decision on the illustration that we're going to create. The actual vehicle, when we're through, will be altered just enough to make it sleeker, to make it proportionally true to our design preferences. We see the vanishing point now being established. Pretty much the same position it was before. We have a person for scale. We won't have these people eventually in front of the vehicle because it spoils the formal profile layout. But for scale, it's a valuable thing to draw people into an illustration at this stage. Just to keep in your mind how big everything is and to reinforce the ability to design a flat illustration with a three-dimensional mentality. That makes it look more real. This will be the finished size. I keep reminding myself that 20 inches by 30 is a fairly large piece of real estate to cover with paint. But it's a nice size for a finished illustration. Plus the fact board comes cut that way in our non-metric part of the world. So having decided definitely on the round gateway, we sketch that in. We're establishing our planting line. We're establishing the intrusion of the squared rectangular features. Actually, that makes the round gate more interesting geometrically. Now we're going to put a crown over the gate, make it a little bit more Romanesque, more formal. Tangent to the top of that curve, we make a horizontal line, and that's where we start our family crest, or whatever we decide to put up there in terms of heraldic detail. Our tree. One of my favorite trees is the Italian cypress, variations on the Italian cypress. And now foliage, very, very quickly put in a stylized way. And now we're going to put in this is the scenario on the right side of the picture. This is the two horse creature riders being handed perhaps another piece of tack or instructions. This is the future after all, so they're doing things a little bit different than a formal English fox hunt. But we're adding these creatures to create a scenario, a human interest activity that makes the whole scene more interesting, number one. It makes it less threatening in terms of just a mechanical device coldly rendered on a sunlit plaza. I've always drawn items with scenario in place. It just is more fun to work on, number one, and you can sink yourself into the fantasy reality of what's going on. It makes it more entertaining to work on, and when you're through, it makes it more satisfying to have finished, and to the observer, it makes it simply more believable. What we're doing now is establishing the light direction, the sun. The sun is high overhead, almost directly overhead, just flush or tangent with the facade surface to cast soft shadows all the way down across the background. We don't have to establish what's causing those shadows. If you remember, I told you earlier, this is a graphical arrangement of a theoretical three-dimensional scene. So we can arrange shadows and things as long as the subject of the shadow, let's say the cause of the shadow, is out of sight. You can pretend that something is up there doing the shadow casting. And because it's graphically more interesting, we get away with it. We now have pretty much the final illustration layout. Vehicle, scenario, foliage positions. masonry alignments, horizon line, vanishing point. It's all ready to go to the next stage, which is to take a simple line drawing idea, a sketch, a line sketch, and apply value so that we have a finished illustration in value rendering to go to the next stage, which is detailed line drawing and eventually color. We have, in effect, completed a plan for a very complicated, very elaborate, three-dimensional illusion in picture form. So we've done the layout in Thumbnail. We've arranged what we have chosen as the sort of the optimum picture alignment, picture composition. And the next step that I go through is to go back over and refine all of the elements in the picture, the actors, let's say, the props, so that when I finally do my final line drawing or trace down line drawing, I'm really satisfied with all the elements that are going to appear in the final illustration. So the vehicle, of course, is the featured prop, and what we're doing now is sort of playing with the organic curves. It's a very dynamic, hand-drawn curve without any mechanical devices. And this is probably the best way to arrive at this kind of a design, because you're not concentrating on lining up a ruler, plotting with a compass, or using a French curve. You're really just drawing. And that frees up your mind, it frees up your choice of elements that are eventually going to be the delineation or the line drawing of the star of the show, which in this case is the Hypervan vehicle. The Hypervan vehicle was originally thought of as a intercity, high-speed, private conveyance. Okay. What I also wanted to do with this design was to reestablish a very strong horizontal alignment of the mass of the vehicle and then raise it off the ground with these large wheel cover extensions, so that in reality the vehicle is a kind of low-flying aircraft. Aerodynamically, the underside of the vehicle has a lot of room to manage airflow, and by different flaps, laminar flow control, and so forth, you have a vehicle that is very stable at high speed and has a very formal, organic, classic look to it. It has a horizontal belt line, which is being drawn right here. It has the upper body, which is very flowing, very organic. And then we have the very mechanical wheel covers that drop down from this proportionally very thin section of the vehicle. The underside, the floor, is, you can see that slightly curved lines on the two I've just drawn, and that describes the actual interior cross-section with the seats and the interior accommodations. So by drawing this several times, you eventually get a kind of an average preference for alignment, for detail on the surface of the vehicle, and this will all be taken into consideration when we do our final line drawing composite, which will be prior to constructing what I call a trace down line drawing for the finished illustration. So the vehicle combines a very soft, organic upper part of the vehicle and a very mechanical lower part, which houses the wheel units. The reflection lines on the vehicle are very, very syrupy, very, very organic, and that also enhances the whole softness of the vehicle's form with the very rigid cut lines and lighting details that slice through the shape at a perfectly horizontal line. So to make the final illustration, we have several actors, characters, elements in the picture, and given the scale and given the features of the primary vehicle, the next set of drawings or sketches would be to have the people. We need people, we need scenario, and the people are not just t-shirt and blue jeans, they're in costumes, a little bit more elaborate than would maybe be the case in real life, but this is an illustration. It's in some undefined future place. So we're going to do a series of figure drawings with costumes and overlays and so forth to get the feeling of drama and difference. I'm very fond of the period in history, I call it the Henry VIII look, where people had rather tight leggings, the men did, and on the upper body were these very, very broad, very heavy capes and large sleeves and so forth. So you almost got a wide look as opposed to a tall and narrow look. And at the present time in our fashion history, we are more in tune with the tall and narrow look than we are with the wide look. Of course, you also have to remember back in medieval times, people weren't all that tall to begin with. They were probably about 5'6", 5'5". So the use of leggings and boots and emblems, cloaks, all of these lend an air of drama and costume strangeness to an illustration. This fellow is wearing a cape, sort of a floor-length jacket kind of affair. And after we get this vocabulary or this catalog of dressed characters, then we can put them into the picture and try out what they look like in the actual scenario that we're in the process of creating. Ornament in clothing tends to be brocade. We have patterns that are everything from paisley to floral patterns, and I use all of these. I'm fascinated with ornament as a visual arrangement, and you combine that with costume, and I think you get a very interesting finished effect. Down through history, the way people dress was usually tuned or matched to their social status. So when we're doing all these costume ideas, we're not just thinking about form or the cut of the cloth or who's wearing it. We're thinking about the graphical, the three-dimensional volume, the adjustment in ornament, all denoting some sort of unexplained reason for the costume being that way. That's the meaning of, or the charm of costume. It's not what you'd see people wearing on the street every day. Haute couture is very high fashion extension of everyday wear. And these characters, with all the ornamentation and the drapery and so forth, will become our sort of haute couture vocabulary for placing people into the finished illustration. The pattern that's being drawn here is, let's say it's a sketch version of perhaps an elaborate gold thread trimmed brocade, or in the future of flexible RGB, red, green, blue, electronic membranes. It could be a glowing pattern which actually would change as the daylight wanes. So you'd have a photoelectric kind of a vector to this whole phenomenon. And as it got darker, the lights would come on and your clothing would glow in different patterns, even animated patterns. Some of these are going to have the Miyake kind of look with the stiffening ribs and the fabric being treated in a certain way to hold its shape. until it's compressed by either body action or body movement, or it has to be compressed to get in and out of a vehicle, for instance. And with the electroelastic fabrics, the RGB flexible substrates coming online in a very short time, all of these things for costume will accelerate very much the illusion of strangeness, of drama, and complementing the form and the stature of the people wearing them. I use a lot of reference from primitive patterns, tribal insignias, and so forth, because it's all available. It's part of human history. It's a library for form. It's a library for geometry. It's a library for cultural icons. And all of this can be used as inspiration for creating elaborate ornamental costumes. So this dress or this costume is getting the brocade treatment. And in the final illustration, this would all be rendered in great detail to make it look absolutely like a kind of a strange metallic brocade texture. You'll see several emblems and hangers coming off the costume, and this is typical of almost military uniforms where you have lanyards and medals dangling off the costume itself. So all I'm doing is taking more or less existing trends or existing fashion cues and accelerating or enlarging them. Inspiration for design and for drawing comes in many forms. And what I like to do is to sort of watch myself draw, to take cues from the way the lines cross. So at this sketch stage, front end of a formal illustration, a lot of the lines that occur actually become cues for refining and continuing into a more finished form. You should allow yourself this freedom of determination. You shouldn't predetermine too much what you're after until you start to see it, start to see yourself drawing it, because a lot of times that can be the trigger for inventing a whole different kind of approach to the object, or in this case the costume ideas that you're drawing. Central, of course, to doing this is having in your head a proportionate map of what human beings are built like in the first place. We're covering up the total top end of the figure here with the legs hanging out. But if we put arms out, you'd have to know where the arms would come out from behind the cape that we've already drawn. So you have to, in your mind, be very aware of how human beings are built, what the geometry and the linkage and the mechanicalness of people is in terms of proportion. Once you have that, then you can draw people in different poses. You can put them inside of things. You can interrupt the normal foot to height geometry, and it all looks completely believable because in your mind you're drawing over a pre-established proportional framework that you've memorized and that you're very familiar with. Learning to draw figures is probably the most difficult thing you'll learn to do, but once learned and having this skill in your head, you'll enjoy creating scenarios much, much more by putting people in them. So we've drawn our basic shape, a kind of stiffened, I suppose, fabric carapace, a cape of sorts, and then we start to attach things and ornament it as we did on the first series of sketch figures. Shading, emblems hanging down, different design additions to the fundamental shape, which is a kind of rounded trapezoid affair on the back of the person wearing it. In the 19th century, when street conditions were rather primitive in the major cities, the people wore great coats. And great coats literally were to protect the finer costume parts underneath from passing carriages splashing on you, literally from things being thrown from upper story balconies in street buildings. And what I've done really is to sort of bring back the idea of great cloak and make it very ornamental, very ceremonial, so that it covers up the figure to whatever length we specify in the drawing. But it is kind of an encounter costume, a costume to wear that gives you the excitement of disguise, gives you the excitement of sort of drama. You're part of a story that only you know the ending for. So it all works together to be a complement to the overall idea of this illustration, which is to create a believable, some future scenario. I have drawers full of these kinds of sketches because the whole idea of designing costume is absolutely fascinating. You make up a kind of sketch story, design the costumes to go along with it, and pretty soon one starts to complement the other, and you can imagine where this person's going, what their motivation is. All of these things become part of this elaborate approach to garment design. And we haven't even talked about helmets yet. Helmets, if you see the next time you see a motorcycle driver on the bike going through traffic with this sort of knight's helmet on, imagine what it would be like to have an electronic helmet that would download information, remind things in your ear of dates, places, directions, and so forth. And you have the electronic secretary of the future. You have a wearable item of clothing that is ornamented, looks nice, looks elaborate, and encases a complete electronic secretarial valet service. And I've used these a lot in illustrations because it gives you the excitement of anonymity. Much like going to a costume ball, you can literally think of yourself as a separate character. So this character has a helmet. We're putting on a cape, which could be part of a sleeve set. But ceremonial garb is fascinating to create, and down through the course of human history, from religious costumes to costumes strictly for drama, storytelling, you have a wide variety to choose from for style and detail and rationale. But central to this whole operation is being very aware of the proportions and the elaborate organic elegance of the human body, both male and female figures. The female of the species is much more flowing, and to complement this organic, the more organic female figure, then you can start adding puffs and enlarged sleeve sections and an ornament that become elaborately feminine, or going into a kind of machismo, change the female into a marauding goddess or a soft, compliant companion. This female figure is wearing one of these electronic helmets, giving both the anonymity of almost like big sunglasses, but now enclosed into a very elaborate electronic device, which is communication, information, and simple costume elegance. Because we have people in this illustration, we're doing quite a lot of character drawing, costume creation, because we have to choose how they're going to be dressed, and the more, if you have the time, the more chances you have of creating your own library of choices, the better off you are for the final illustration. We can use the more formal outlines for this male figure of a suit of clothes. We have a semi-cape over one arm. So that's borrowing from military formal dress. We have a high collar. So this is almost a 19th century waistcoat. We're in a way we're gravitating toward a variation of the formal wear for the hunt, where we have fitted jackets. Nowadays they're bright red and they're called pinks for some odd reason. But here we've added sort of a cape affair at the shoulder down to the elbow. We have jodhpurs, breeches, and riding boots. Costume complements role playing. If you have sports, you have the extremely overt padding alignments of football uniforms for American football. For tennis, for boxing, for different sports, you have identifiable costumes which have cues for bracing, protection, padding, and so forth. And you can play with this idea to do composites which make the costumes you design more interesting. In this case, the side view, the helmet, is a variation of the classic protective helmet that riders wear for dressage or horse-oriented sports. Again, we've used a cape, which does great things for the upper body down to the waist. We have fairly short jacket, the bottom of the jacket on the coat. We have breeches, the extension off to the sides, boots. So now we have a variation of the formal hunting costume, complete with a protective helmet, a little bit more elaborate drapery and fabric on the jacket part. We have gloves, a short tail on the jacket, jodhpurs and tight riding boots. When we get to the final illustration, you'll see some of these elements being used in the costuming for the characters in the final illustration. A back view in this case, using a high collar, it adds drama from the front, adds a lot of drama to the edges of the face. And the back can become a kind of a signboard for graphics, brocade, so forth. There's another element which we'll get to of treating the friction areas of a costume with a different fabric, like an inset. These would be the inside of the arms and the legs. And indeed, in formal riding wear, the wear points are double padded, is a whole separate patch. Much like a shooting jacket for the shoulder, for the gun butt to rest against, in formal riding wear you'll have an inset, which is literally to protect the fabric at extra wear points. Here we're shading in the inner lining, or the inner part of the costume of the leg set. This also adds a graphical three-dimensional aspect to the costume, because as the figure turns, these areas appear and disappear and lend an interesting flash of detail into the, let's say, the monotone color, whatever that might be, of the costume. So it's a very nice contrast, and of course it thins down the clothing elements also. And the helmet on top. So for a back view, we now have a character with much more high-tech sort of costume. We now have formal wear points reinforced with fabric shift color. And we go into the last set of costume drawings. Just giving ourselves one more chance to design and create dramatic costume clothing items for our characters in the final illustration. Here we have a costume which is asymmetrical. We have a very, very strong enlarged sleeve item or element on the left side, and we're joining that with the traditional breeches or jodhpurs and boots. And because the left arm is differentiated from the right arm in a lot of sports, this is a stylistic extension of that idea. Here is a side view of that same enlarged sleeve detail as part of a very tight-fitting, slim body jacket clothing. So you get an extreme contrast in contour between the upper body, with the arm extensions being enlarged, and the thin section and silhouette of the lower limbs. And this, again, this is very medieval. The enlarged, brocaded carapace and cape as part of the formal costume. As society and technology advance in terms of each using, complementing the other, you get a shift in proportion of luxury versus attainable economic parity. And what we're seeing in fashion is that the whole idea of royal attire is now copied and accentuated and celebrated in clothing for the everyman. And that's again what I'm doing in these sketches, is to enlarge and use what used to be royal proportions for fairly ordinary activity clothing. In all cultures, you have ornamentation on clothing items as a cloak, a kind of identity addition to the person's importance, as an addition to their persona, how they're perceived by others. And this is the job of costume. The accenting of social role and activity that people looking at you assume that, well, you do this or that. All sports have their distinctive costume requirements or alignments. And what we're doing is taking some of those cues and shifting them into the social arena of clothing and apparel. We'll add a few medals, some graphical additions to the costume here. Definitely accenting the upper body, band across the chest, out onto the enlarged sleeves of this costume. A center accent. Little strip of brocade. So it looks very rich. Really what we're doing is taking a kind of bland, ordinary, maybe costume element and adding to it in terms of ornamentation and pattern that takes it a notch above what it would be without these kinds of details. It's intensely theatrical. And since we're creating essentially a theatrical event, a scenario, I think it's very apropos to play with these costumes to this extent and make sure that we have our characters, our people in the scenario, nicely dressed. Inspiration starts when your pen or your pencil hits paper. We do an alignment, vertical alignment, for the axis of the character, and then we start to draw the human proportion underlay. The average character, the classic character, is 8 heads high. That's top of head to chin. The chest level is 1 head down, and so forth on down the proportional drawing of the character. Once you fix these alignments and these geometries in your mind, and how the muscles connect, how the limbs articulate, forever after that you have a in-head model which you can draw on and create costumes over correctly proportioned people throughout your entire career. And bear in mind that knowing the correct proportions of the human figure, if you want to deliberately distort, as costumes often do, you have to start with a knowledge of what it looks like, what the people look like underneath all that stuff. Because if you don't, it simply is not going to register that somebody's in a costume. They'll look deformed, or look like something's wrong, or you've forgotten something on the sketch to begin with. So knowing how to draw people, I think, and I've reviewed this in my career, is a very, very valuable skill. Societies decorate their extensions of social status. Think of the Coldstream Guards in London with the palace. Think of the elaborate costumes of the bandmaster, the band itself, performers who are celebrated in sports. All of these different areas have their own significant look, and ornament is certainly part of it. Military dress uniforms, for sure. The medals they wear, the lanyards, that's the rope from around through the epaulette and around to the other side with the dangling cords on the front. So formal wear is almost always highly ornamented, from the ecclesiastical dressage of the Catholic Church, for instance, and high Episcopalian, to the robes and the gloves and so forth of different social job categories. It all has a very formal, highly decorative look. And that's what we're doing here, is to borrow from those formal styles and apply them to our characters in our scenario. This lends an air of drama, and it heightens the appreciation of something going on. It's part of the story. These aren't quite as exaggerated as formal fashion drawings. Fashion drawings tend to be much more linear, vertically, usually, and they have flowing lines, and they're simply an idea guide. They're not meant to be anatomically correct or even correctly proportioned. It's all to draw a picture of the idea of the costume, not the actual costume itself. So we're combining a modern-day helmet, most prominent in the motorcycle field, which has the same mystique as the knights' helmets of medieval times. So we're really creating, in effect, a retro medieval period approach to costuming for this particular illustration. Fabric has a bias to it. So when you drape fabric, you have to be aware of how the fabric is woven. As we move into flexible RGB substrates, the costuming ideas will become much more animated and elaborate, because now you can actually program the fabric to be a color, to display a pattern, and that's going to change forever the whole idea of how we think about clothing. So I'm primarily concerned when I draw costumes now of the graphical possibilities of this kind of a technology, because that's what's going to happen. We're using a extension of the collar here with a big medallion in the back, at the back of the head. Some of the cultures around the world have elaborately extended hat shapes. The Japanese in particular, from the classic Edo period, had elaborate hair and hat part costumes that were very, very much a denotation of social status. So again, we're borrowing from mankind's history of costuming, how costuming was used to denote social status, and particularly the separation between royalty or religious symbology and the common person on the street. So as we emblazon fabric with these elaborate patterns, whether they're programmed or actually sewn in brocade, we're really announcing that we're somebody, that the characters have a social position and a social function that is beyond just being in a place because they happen to be there. They're there for a purpose. They're dressed elaborately, and that makes the situation and the scenario a little bit more exciting. It makes it more memorable, and it makes us pay attention. I did a whole series of these kinds of fashion overlays. I called them encounter cloaks, and they really were for dressing aliens who were visiting us, who might have body openings or strange physical characteristics that would be obnoxious to us. If you can imagine a 7.5-foot spider or a grasshopper, for instance, and the encounter cloaks allowed them to be ornamental and socially adaptable to a situation without scaring the pants off of the people that were in the same situation with them. And in a certain way, these costumes that I've been drawing are encounter cloaks. They're put on for a specific appearance, and whether the social status they announce is real or not, they do contribute to the scenario in an ornamental and a programmatic way. So now we have the vehicle has been thought about, the picture composition has been thought about and arranged. We have our cast of characters, and we can pick from these characters, this spread of character portfolio, to enliven and furnish our finished scenario line drawing. And the next phase goes into further refining the different elements of the illustration so that by the time we get ready to do our final trace down line drawing, we've got everything designed and detailed and specified to our satisfaction. The horse is an incredible animal. They're beautiful to watch in motion, and horses have been around for thousands of years. The different breeds of horses are very specifically designed or bred for a given purpose. Riding horses are more elegantly proportioned than draft horses or horses that pulled wagons and heavy loads, and their alignment, the anatomy, is fascinating to draw because it has an elegance and a dynamic that is hard to appreciate unless you actually draw these creatures. So we're adding now 2 characters, animal characters, to our scenario, and I certainly like to play around with the gene code, the DNA, and come up with creatures that are a resemblance of an animal like a horse or a dog, but have a strange genetically altered look to them. In this case, what we've done is taken the elegant alignments and the anatomy of the horse and added a kind of reptilian head. And in the future, if we start to play with the genetics of different creatures, we'll be able to achieve these, let's say, visually entertaining variations of familiar animals. This has already been done in the dog field for sure. There are many, many breeds of dogs, and they all started off as wolves. From the tiny, tiny teacup Yorkies to the giant Russian hound dogs, they all started from a common ancestor. So it's already happened in the case of the dog world. All we're doing is accelerating this idea and overlaying it onto the classic and elegant proportions of the common horse. What this does for us is to make the picture at once familiar and strange. And that's the goal of these kinds of illustrations, is to entertain, to visually interrupt your expectations and add a new layer of entertainment, visual entertainment, to a very familiar set of proportions and detail. And who knows, with the advances in robotic technology, we may very well build these things as mechanical constructs, electronic mechanical constructs, that are a horse, but the horse can be turned off. What we're doing now is constructing a human being riding on a horse. We have the proportions in our head, so the arms and the legs and the body are pretty much correctly related to each other. And then we can start adding costuming to this character. The horse is there in very, very faint lines, just as the carrier. And this gives us a visual guidelines to place the horse, this beast, into proportions, into perspective in the final illustration. You always have to bear in mind that you're creating a three-dimensional object, but you're only drawing one view of it. That's very critical. Then, on top of that, you're picking the one view and slightly adjusting the outlines and so forth, so that you also have an interesting composition on the picture plane, as well as the appreciation that you're rendering a one-time view in flat plane of a three-dimensional event. And once you do this for years and years and years, you start to appreciate how easy it is, but at the start, it's difficult. I have to agree. You have to pay attention and notice things. Never let a day go by without noticing something that's different around you that you haven't seen before, because in this way you'll build up a vocabulary of reality that you can use and adjust and put into your illustration work, regardless, again, of the media. It could be electronic, hand-drawn, but you need that vocabulary of how stuff looks so that you can copy it accurately or selectively distort it and change the proportions to make it more entertaining. The foliage in the final illustration will be a combination of realistic vines on stone, foliage in realistic terms, the Italian cypress, which we'll see earlier or later. This is a very stylized way to do foliage. What we're doing is drawing the drops, the bough, separate elements that go together to make a tree or a large bush, and this becomes a very, very elegant representation of real foliage. And this has to be felt. You have to get into the mood of knowing why foliage looks the way it does. Then you can stylize the illusion of seeing what it is without having to specifically do all the leaves, all the little flowers, but anybody looking at this will instantly know that it's foliage. It's not rocks. It's not part of architecture. It's foliage as an elegant delineation of a stylized version. Foliage has depth. It's very, very three-dimensional. It has a backside. It has an inside. And all of these different elements go together to make a tree, to make a bush. And as you look out over a park or down the street, you'll see these elements as separate, distinct parts of the whole, which is a tree or a large clump of foliage. Once you have this feeling in your head, then you can go ahead and characterize it. You can draw pictures of it in different variations. Here we're now starting to put some detail underneath this foliage clump, which could be vine work, it could be flowers, it could be a flowering bush, along with the landscaping that goes to make up the foliage bank. And going back to our sketches, this will be the detail on the extreme right side of our finished illustration. So, as we did with the costumes, as we did with the hypervan itself, as we did with the horse character, we're building a vocabulary of design, a vocabulary of visual cues to use in the final illustration. Regardless of whether they're going to be behind something, what we're doing is memorializing our feelings and our appreciation of all the elements that go into making a finished illustration. At this stage, with this cross-hatching and the pen technique, it's very quick, and you can delineate very, very accurately, get a perfect example, a perfect guideline of how it's going to look when it's put into value and color. It's an elaborate way of pre-visualizing your final result. It's very precise, and even if it went no further than this, it would be an interesting drawing just to look at and to appreciate. The detailing here, the trick is to visualize the leaf pattern and the flowers and so forth as units. You're illustrating the whole between each of those little individual events. So you have to keep in mind two things. One is, are you drawing flowers or leaves? The other is, you're only drawing negative space. You're drawing the holes that occur between each of these little tiny floral elements. And once you get that in your head, then it'll come a little easier. I love to do this kind of detailing because foliage, it's random, it's a natural phenomenon, and even though, for instance, an oak tree has tens of thousands of leaves, each leaf is instantly identified as an oak leaf as opposed to a maple leaf. So nature has created this system. In reality, it's kind of a fractal system of visual arrangement. And when you're doing this kind of drawing, you're typifying a foliage illusion without having to draw individual leaves and flowers and so forth. You're indicating the visual impact of the foliage, not the exact drawing like a botanical artist would do. And when you're all done, it has a feeling of lush growth. It has integrity in terms of looking like foliage, even though it is not real leaves and branches and so forth. And it has an elegance to it, which is probably has even more impact than going through the laborious procedure of actually painting a real tree with all the branches and the leaves and so forth. As a picture element, it satisfies all the requirements of a soft foliage addition to the scenario without having to be laboriously botanical. Now this foliage bank will go up against the wall of the facade, in front of the facade, in the final illustration. Here we're putting in a sketch outline of an Italian cypress, one of my favorite types of plants. They're very elegant, they're tall and thin, and they give beautiful accent to architecture and to the general foliage landscape as a vertical accent. And these trees do have the occasional hole which you look through to possibly a couple of branches. But this random detail, edge control and so forth, is what gives foliage its magical qualities when inserted into a very mechanical, very architectural environment. As the detail system changes texture, then that's how you go from tree to flower bank to vines on the wall. All of these shifts in texture give you the visual clue to recognize what it is, what you're looking at. So once we have all of our elements drawn in many choices, so that we have the ability to pick and choose and determine what the final line drawing is going to look like, this stage, I think, is very necessary for creating a successful fantasy illustration. I suppose there are people who could go right into paint, grab a brush, and paint their way to glory. But all these steps that I go through, they might seem laborious, but in the end they're very, very worthwhile, and they let you evaluate and make up your mind before you start on the final artwork, because if there's deadlines involved, and in commercial artwork there always is, what you want to do is be sure, very sure, before you start the laborious, time-consuming part of the assignment, that you have all the stuff that you really like, that you approve of, and that you think will make a very, very dynamic, successful illustration. And when you start to interrupt foliage patterns with hard architectural detail, you can start to see the contrast and why foliage is such a valuable part of architectural illustration. In this case, the facade of our picture of the hypervan in the retro future courtyard. So with a few more details of this flower bank, doing a little bit more retouching on the foliage mass, we will have completed all the elements in multiple choice stages of the different parts, the different contributors to the drama of the finished illustration. The shading, the delineation of dark areas, all of this contributes to the dimensional illusion of our foliage bank, which will be placed at the far right of the finished illustration. Having now completed all the character and prop and stage set elements for our finished illustration, we're going to do one last visualization in sketch form that's more elaborate than the quick run-throughs we did before. This is going to be a shot looking down at the facade and the hypervan positioned in front of the gateway. And we're adding some elements that are more specific than we had done before. So we have steps leading down. The steps are round. They're sort of repeating the geometry of the gateway, only at 90-degree orientation. And this is to make one last check on an alternate view, just to make sure that before we start spending lots and lots of time doing a full color illustration, that we really have picked the best view of this scenario. And you can also now get a clue as to the slight offset of some of the features. For instance, the two rectangular elements coming in to interrupt the round geometry of the gate, we can see they have a thickness to them. They're set out from the flat plane of the facade. We can start to appreciate what this stage set looks like in 3 dimensions and arrange some of our details. you can never do yourself short by exploring the three-dimensional characteristics of whatever scenario you're going to be illustrating. I often will do these sets of three-dimensional views, alternate views, just to establish that I'm thinking properly in terms of a three-dimensional solution to the illustration idea. And this exercise, to this extent, I mean, this is elaborate in terms of, over and over again exploring the different characteristics of what you're going to be illustrating, but you can never go wrong just making sure, because you're going to be spending days illustrating your final choice. And at this stage, as I mentioned before, if you have clients who are visually sophisticated enough to show them this kind of a drawing and they can appreciate what they're seeing, it's also a very nice, for sure, check on what everybody has agreed that you're to do. Most of my work is done for commercial assignment. This particular series, being one of my own creation illustrations, I was the client, and you will find as you go into your professional career that you become your most severe critic. As you get better and better and better at what you do, you can pick out mistakes, you can nitpick your solutions, and what you have to do is to admit that you do not have infinite time. You have to do the best you can and learn to trust your intuition once you've practiced and have mastered the basic techniques of picture making. Learn to trust your best initiative idea and go with it. If you endlessly massage and waffle on what eventually you're going to do, now this is not saying that making sure that what you're going to do is right, but there's a point where you just have to make the decision and say, this is the best one, this is the way to go, and you start to complete the job, because there's always another job down the road that you have to start on. This is essentially being a professional, being engaged in commercial commissions. You do not have infinite time. So at the start of your career, if you can master some of these basic visualization routines and techniques, it will serve you very, very well. You'll be able to, sometimes as you're talking to the client, even at the very, very early stages of listening to them tell you what they want, you'll already start to visualize the solution as a kind of memory aid to constructing the finished illustration once you get back to your studio. So we've done this facade before, but now we're doing two views at a more elaborate level so that we can just make that final determination that this is, in fact, the best way to go. It has the advantage of making it more real to you, so you can have it locked into your head, the detail systems, the alignments, all of the different bits and pieces that make up a successful fantasy techno illustration. This detail is eventually going to be an elaborate carved, a kind of Baroque pattern carved into the stone, and this is reminiscent of the elaborate carvings on the facades of medieval cathedrals around the altarpiece. It's a kind of stone filigree pattern. Some of it is oriented towards natural leaf forms or grain and so forth, vegetables even. But essentially what it is an elaborate way of ornamenting what otherwise would be a flat, very uninteresting surface. And it's usually done as an accent to walls and doorways. In this case, what we're doing, really, is to create a memorial entrance almost to the extent of the ancient Medici's the announcement that we're about to go into a very important place, and by shading these different areas, we're achieving dimension. We're drawing and memorializing this idea that we've come up with in previous sketch form. So we've created the facade. We have drawn so that we can appreciate the dimensional qualities of the facade. Not very deep relief, but nevertheless relief enough to make it not just a flat surface. What I'm doing here is to, in order to create a volume, sometimes if you create a center section in perspective, it helps you to visualize the overall form. So I've drawn a center section. Now I'm creating essentially a three-dimensional volume using that as a guide. That's a nice way to rapidly visualize a three-dimensional form. So even at this stage, you can see the contrast between this very elaborate pseudo-medieval architectural elements as a stage set, and then this sleek, syrupy, organic vehicle posed in front of it. And I think the contrast is really quite nice. We're going to complete the foliage cluster in the corner, in the flat elevation at the far right of the picture. All of these things, as you're drawing at this sketch stage, provide detail, ideas, provide little bits and pieces that you could incorporate into the final illustration. And by doing this, you're sort of sneaking up on your final decision, your final determination of what you're going to spend quite a lot of time completing as a formal illustration. The whole idea of reflections is kind of a mystery, but all you have to remember, is to remind yourself that a shiny object, no matter how convoluted or how organic it is really a system of many, many, many little tiny mirrors all plastered onto the surface. And if you did that, you would very easily see that a reflection pattern on a three-dimensional object is really a combination of all these little tiny sections merging into a constant reflected picture of what's opposite the surface itself. And once you understand that, you can synthesize the whole reflection geometry fairly accurately. The thing about rendering, the thing about illustrating scenarios, is that the layperson, somebody who has no idea of art, is not an artist, they've seen reality every day of their lives, and if something isn't right, they will know it. They won't know why, but something will tell them that something is not like it should be. And that destroys the illusion of reality. It destroys the illusion of peering into a custom-made, illustrated scenario, and it sort of makes all your work of no avail, which is a shame. So we've pretty much described this stage set of ours in very tight detail. We now have a dimensional view looking down. We've done this before, but not to this level of detail and sketching technique, cross-hatching, shadowing. So this is a three-dimensional look at what we're eventually going to draw as a straight-on elevation profile view of the hypervan sitting in the courtyard. All the details, the perspective, everything lines up in its own sort of three-dimensional cage of alignment and reference to the horizon line, to the flat planes in the picture. And once we've decided all that, then we decide the lighting angle, and we'll just sketch in the shading of the shadows coming down across the facade from some unknown interruption source above our heads. I may have mentioned before that you don't really have to show what's causing the shadow, but the shadow is a graphical interruption of the continuity of the scene that you're drawing. It lends interest, and it duplicates real life. In real life, we have shadows from buildings, shadows from overhanging cornices, things that influence the way light falls on surfaces. And keep reminding yourself, in this case, that the sun is high overhead. It's a little bit to the upper right as we're looking at it now, and it's casting these shadows at a very, very steep angle down across this facade. The thing to remember about shadows is that the closer the object that's casting the shadow is to the surface that the shadow is cast onto, the darker the shadow will be. So if you're standing in the street and you see a fuzzy sort of gray square right around you, and as it gets darker and darker, you probably should step away, because that means something's coming down very, very fast. These shadows will be much lighter in the final illustration than the shadow right underneath the hypervan itself. You can see just by this very quick addition of shadow indication with this cross-hatching that the picture now has a little bit more dynamic interest. Just one last touch on the foliage to make it more dimensional. Some more little holes back into the foliage mass to separate it and delineate the random edge control that foliage gives an illustration. So now that we have all the elements, we've sketched the foliage, we've sketched the hypervan itself, we've done several investigations of the facade, the stage set, and we're going to make one last very careful delineation of the stage set, the facade background, to a greater level of detail than we have done so far. The next stage would be to formalize this sketch approach with the ruler and compass, making a very careful overlay, and that'll be the next stage prior to going into full color on the illustration. So we're repeating the geometry we've established before. We have a vanishing point, we have a depth of the gateway, we're putting in some people for scale, and we're going to spend a little bit more time shading and formalizing this facade stage set. You can see even the figure on the left of these two has the wide cape accented costume. We will not put the hypervan in this drawing. That is in front of, and what we're doing is doing a final investigation and alignment and sort of detail rendition of what we're going to use as the eventual facade geometry. We have the crest or the coat of arms of this theoretical group above the archway.